91. Oh, I $768. $768. Oh, oh, we have heard the joyful sound. Jesus saved, Jesus saved. Spread the tidings all around. Jesus saved, Jesus saved. Bear the news to every land. Climb the steeps and cross the ways. Onward to sing 938. $938. Oh, oh, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame of holy name, on Jesus' name, on Christ the solid rock I stand.
Well, I'd like to welcome each one to our service here this evening. Thank you to each one who's came out and to support this. And we're looking forward to what the Lord has for us tonight and what Brother Edsel has to share regarding our history. I was hoping Edsel was going to show up tonight. I knew he didn't forget about it, but I didn't message him. But I believe he has a grandson that's about 36 hours old, and I thought maybe he'd be rather seeing him this evening than seeing us. But we are thankful he worked it into a schedule to be here. Just for a brief opening, I'd like to read from Psalm chapter 78. We are, again, tonight we're thinking of history. We've been studying the history of our church, of our people, and we've gotten snapshots of even our local history here throughout that. And that's what we're going to be looking at here for this final time this evening. We'll read here in Psalm chapter 8, Psalm chapter 78. There's indications here of history or things that have happened of the law of the Lord being handed down from generation to generation. Just want to go ahead and read the first 8 verses. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. For he established a testimony in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded to our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. And so if I stop reading right there, what does this psalm look like? It sounds like there was lots of good things that have been handed down from one generation to the next. It would seem like they were all pretty good people. They obeyed the Lord, and they wanted their children to obey the Lord, so these things got handed down verbally to them. But let's read verse 8 yet. And might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. So thrown into there, obviously in their past, there was things that were not always upright. They were somewhere in their fathers. There was a stubborn and a rebellious generation, and I think no matter who you are tonight, somewhere there's lots of good in the past of most of you in your generations. There's also, I'm sure you can, if you look for it, you can find things that are not good as well. And handing things down verbally from one generation to the next, it is a good way to remind people of the goodness of God. But also, when things come down in story form like that, it's also generally slanted to how the storyteller possibly wanted it to look. And I don't think there's any of us that are exempt from that. We all have, you have your perspective and I have my perspective. And so I think there is value at times in going back, not just hearing the stories as it was told to me by my father or my grandfather or my uncle or whoever, but maybe going back to the source, if it's available, and seeing what actually did happen. And sometimes I think that broadens our perspective and maybe gives us a better understanding at times of our history. So I think hopefully what we're doing here tonight is part of that. That we can. There's lots of good in our past. There's also things maybe that are not so good. So let's see what the Lord has for us tonight. These thoughts. Let's stand for a word of prayer. Brother Mark, would you want to pray for us here? Stand.
Father, we see that you work that set aside. Father, you extend our hearts and lives. Father, as we direct the service and say, guys.
Thank you. You may be seated. All right, this time we'll give our time over to Brother Edsel Burdge.
Well, greetings in Jesus' name this evening. When Clinton asked me at his parents' 50th anniversary if I would think about doing this, I said yes, but I'm not going past 1975. So that's where I'm going to look at. And what he asked me to do, what he asked me to do was to talk about the kind of focus or end up with the formation of the Cumberland Valley Mennonite Church. And so that's what I will be ending up with. But I feel as though there needs to be some background to help understand what's going there. And of course, the thing is, I know that there are brothers and sisters sitting here, some of the older ones who went through some of this when they were younger and may have much better information than I do about it. What I have is basically what I've read in documents and also talking with people. But I did have the benefit of talking to some people who were older and who are no longer with us. So just to look at the background. The Mennonites moved into the valley here starting in the 1730s, the late 1730s. And there were continual migrations into the valley from elsewhere up until about the 1860s. There were kind of sets of people coming in. Most of them, not quite all of them, but most of them are coming from Lancaster County. And the Mennonite churches that formed in this area, the old congregations are Chambersburg, Strasburg, Browns Mill, which later on became Marion. And the Row is actually one of the later congregations here in the valley in the 19th century. It didn't really come into being until the 1830s, 100 years after the first people moved into the area. And of course, down in Washington County, you had that was actually a larger settlement in the early years. And the historic congregations there were Millers, Staufers, Clear Spring. Then there was a congregation called Whitmer's, which later on kind of moved location, became known as Rife's, which is where kind of a large thing. So, and very early on in the 19th century, there kind of developed two districts, two bishop districts, a Franklin County district and a Washington County district. And up until about 1839, the churches in this community were part of Lancaster Mennonite Conference. And the leaders would go out there for conference meetings. But around 1939, they set apart a separate conference that became known as Washington Franklin Mennonite Conference. Though the ministers and bishops continued to go out to Lancaster for their conference meetings, and oftentimes Lancaster bishops would come here to the valley to attend the conference meetings here. So it's very much a cooperative arrangement there. In fact, up until 1922, the Washington Franklin Mennonite Conference simply used the Lancaster Conference's discipline as their own. And oftentimes, Lancaster's conference meeting in the fall was held about a week before Washington Franklin's. And so Lancaster would make a decision, and Washington Franklin next week they would get together, and they basically would ratify that position. Though I would have to say that overall, the Washington Franklin churches were more conservative than Lancaster was as a whole. Now, Lancaster had pockets that were just as conservative as what Washington Franklin was, but part of that had to do with the fact that both in Washington County, Maryland, and up here particularly in the Row, most of the people who came here came from the Weaverland district. All right. And that was a very conservative community in Lancaster County, and of course gave rise in the 1890s to what became known as Weaverland Conference, an old order Mennonite group that broke away from Lancaster. And it was very significant that here in Washington Franklin, we never had an old order split, because the old order split in Lancaster kind of bled off the most conservative element in Lancaster. But here in Washington County, there were plenty of people that were minded that way, particularly up here at the Row and down at Rife's Church, who were minded that way, had that sort of mentality, but they stayed. They continued on it. And that helped to kind of keep the community even a little bit more conservative character. All right? Between the years 1850 and 1900, there are two major changes. One of them is the switch from German to English. The last preacher who preached in German was Peter Wadel, who is the ancestor of a number of you here. He only preached in German. I think he died around 1905 or something like that. Joseph Martin, who was ordained here in 1895, could not preach in English. He was the first in German. He couldn't preach. He spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, but he couldn't speak English. He couldn't read German. And so he preached in English. And so pretty much by 1900, that transition to English had been accomplished. And then the other thing that's happening is the introduction of Sunday schools. Now, that's an uneven kind of thing happening. Some churches, starting in the 1870s, began to have Sunday school. Interesting enough, the first Sunday schools were not up here in Franklin County. They were down in Washington County at Clear Spring and at Stouffer's and so on. And the Row was one of the last churches to have Sunday school. Nelson Bear told me that his grandmother, preacher Joseph Martin's wife, would come to church, and she would never take a Sunday school quarterly because she didn't really believe in Sunday school, but she thought she should be here when the church was open. But it was kind of her way of going along with things, but not quite giving in entirely. She was more old order minded. But the years from 1900 to 1925 are fairly significant. Some fairly significant changes and developments happen. That's the period of time in which revival meetings, week-long revival meetings, become kind of a standard thing in most of the churches here. Not all, but most of them. There's a interest in missions, both in establishing congregations, new congregations, outreaches, and so on. Pond Bank is the first one of those, and Harvey Shank, who is a school teacher, was ordained as the first minister there, and some of his descendants are sitting here in this meeting. There was the local mission board was formed in 1915, but there were also some things that some new ideas. One of the things that was introduced into the area was premillennialism, the premillennial doctrine, which was resisted. Actually, the conference made a ruling that their ministers were not to speculate an unfulfilled prophecy, and that was directed against the premillennial teaching. Though in the 1920s, there are some younger leaders who are ordained who hold to that, but they had to make the promise that they wouldn't teach it. Interesting enough, J. Irvin Layman, who was a very strong premillennialist, but a gentle soul in some ways, and was used quite much abroad. He held meetings elsewhere. He was a well-used evangelist. He always abided by that understanding that he had made here in the conference. But when he was out of the conference, he didn't mind teaching it. So I guess you had to go hear him elsewhere to do that. But between the years 1925, and one of the things I should mention is the church is growing. Okay, it's growing. Around 1900, there's about 500 members in the valley. Okay, now I'm not including the churches up in Cumberland County, like Slate Hill, Churchtown, and Dillers, and so on. They were still part of Lancaster Conference, all right? There's about 500 members here. And in the first quarter of the 20th century, it's growing. The new methods, Sunday school, revival meetings did have a beneficial impact in a sense of young people responding and joining church and stuff like that. Though that old order element that was here resisted some of that, and particularly here at the Row, at Rice and so on. In many cases, these new things were resisted, and they were kind of held at bay for the first 25 years. But from 1925 to 1940, Bishop John Burkholder wrote a letter to one of the bishops out in Lancaster County, and he wrote around 1929, and he said, "We have serious trouble in our church." So they had it back then too, you know. And the trouble revolved around, for the most part, John F. Grove, a minister at Cedar Grove Mennonite Church. Cedar Grove was set off in 1905 by the element at Rice Church who really wanted Sunday school, revival meetings, and more of an active mission outreach and stuff like that. And so that element were set up, and a new church, a new congregation was established in 1905. John F. Grove's family, his parents' family, he was a young man when this happened, not yet married. But around 1917, I think, he was actually ordained to the ministry at Cedar Grove. He was the first person ordained there. Up until that time, it was the Rife ministry who took care of Cedar Grove. He was a very progressive-minded person, a very able person. Apparently, from reports I heard, he was a rather dynamic speaker. He became well known outside of the area. He would go and have revival meetings and so on like that. He was one of the things he was really against was tobacco, was the use of tobacco. And he was out at a meeting one time in Lancaster County, and I guess this must have been the practice or something. A member in the congregation or somebody who attended his meetings came up and gave him a $5 bill. He said, "Here, I just wanted to give this to you as a present," and so on. He said, "But I have to let you know that I made that $5 bill raising tobacco." And John Grove said, "That's okay. The devil's had that money long enough." And so he took the $5. So he was quite a character in many ways. However, he also had some problems. Most of which had to do with his family. His children were disobedient. His wife was somewhat of a problem at various points of time, and also he was a fairly progressive leader in a bishop district that was still very traditional, and he also was a premillennialist. Okay, and on the other hand, in his contemporaries, the two major, now there were a number of ministers there, I'm not going to name them all, but the two probably most important people down in Washington County who were contemporaries of John F. Grove was preacher John Risser at Miller's Church and preacher Moses K. Hurst at Rice Church. And John Risser was a very capable Bible teacher. And he was used also outside of our community, primarily at Bible conferences. There's a recording of a sermon that he gave out at New Danville Mennonite Church, part of a series, I forget which book, one of Paul's letters that he was teaching on. And it's on an old wire recording, which is a really old form of recording. And about two-thirds of the sermon, they were able to get about two-thirds of the sermon off. And it was really interesting for me to listen to that because he was a really good Bible teacher. Very methodical, very clear in his presentation, and so on. And so he was a very influential, very conservative-minded minister in Washington County. And then we have Moses K. Hurst, who came from a family. His father was a very traditional-minded person at Rice Church. Moses himself did not join the church until he was in his mid-30s. Okay, but he continued. His mindset, nonetheless, was that very traditional, almost old order mindset. And so we kind of have these two different sort of ways of looking at things that sort of sets the stage. But it would not have caused so much problem, except for the fact that John F. Grove's family, and particularly his wife, and I won't get into all the details of that. You can read my book, and it has it there. It's a sad story, and so on. Some people thought I shouldn't have told that, but everything here. But I felt the need to explain it all, because if I didn't, then some other people would look bad, because the church had at various times to deal with him. Bishop Denton Martin at various times had to deal with him, and so on. And if I didn't explain what was actually going on here, it would just make Denton Martin look like he was a mean old person. And he wasn't. He was trying to deal with some fairly serious issues. Well, the fact that, and this, you probably have seen this before too, popular people can get away with more than the rest of us can. Have you seen that? And that was true of John F. Grove. He was very popular, particularly in his congregation, particularly among some of the Franklin County churches and so on. He was very popular, and when the ministries tried to work with him, he had the support of most of his congregation there at Cedar Grove, and also some of the Mennonites in Franklin County, particularly at Marion Mennonite Church, which tended to be somewhat similar mindset as what Cedar Grove was. Then in Franklin County during these years, again, Marion and Pond Bank, particularly Marion, had some very capable leadership like J. Irvin Lehman, like Harvey Shank. They tended to be more progressive in their, more aggressive in their outreach and so on like that. And again, both J. Irvin Lehman and Harvey were premillennial, though Harvey never made much of an issue of it. Okay, it wasn't really a big theme of his from what I could understand. And here at the Row, the leaders were Chris Martin, preacher Chris Martin, and his brother Amos Martin. Okay, and again, they're coming from here at the Row. That old order sentiment is still kind of here. It's changed. It's not quite. It's not like Weaverland settlement, Weaverland Mennonites or anything like that. But there's some elements that are similar to that. All right. In 1930. The Washington Franklin Conference adopted a new discipline. They had their first discipline that was under their name was 1922. In 1930, they adopted a new discipline. They had made some changes. In this period of time, the radio had come in to being, and so they had to make a decision what they were going to do about the radio. And they said, and the discipline read, that the radios are protested against. Now, do you know what that means? They're protested against. Well, the best I can figure out is you really ought not to have one, but we are not going to kick you out of the church for having one. All right. Now, or we're not going to discipline you for having one. We'd rather you didn't have one. All right. And I think part of that is because they already had gotten a foothold in and people found it hard to get rid of it. The older Amish are facing that dilemma right now with the cell phones. There are bishops who'd like to get rid of these cell phones, but they can't because they're already there. But one of the things that was generally accepted is that ministers should not have radios. Okay. And in Washington County, there was more feeling against radios than there was in some areas up here in Franklin County, particularly in churches like Marion and so on. I have a feeling that there was probably a pretty strong sentiment here at the Row against radios. But the significant change in the discipline had to do with excommunication. The old discipline and the practice in the past was that the bishop was charged with excommunicating an offender with the consent of the congregation, with the consent of the church. In 1930, that was changed to the bishop was charged with seeing through excommunications with the consent of his ministry. Okay, and so the consenting body was changed from congregation to ministry. And there were some people who objected to that. It was actually kind of a change from the older way of doing things. But there was a reason for it. And I would tell you that John F. Grove was probably the reason, because he was doing things that the rest of the leadership in Washington County really objected to. And there were some things, serious things to object to and so on. But they couldn't deal with him because his congregation stood behind him. They would not have consented to him being dealt in any kind of way because he was so popular. And I think that's why they changed the discipline. And there were people that objected to that. And they also talked, again, like I said, Lancaster was often involved in the council of the churches here. And they talked to the Lancaster bishop. Lancaster bishop said, well, we have news for you. That's how we do it in Lancaster. So they did not get, the people who didn't like this change didn't get much sympathy from the Lancaster bishops. Between 1929 and 1938, John F. Grove was in constant trouble. All right, he was in constant trouble, and I'm not going to go into all the issues and so on there. The Lancaster bishops got involved in the whole issue and so on. And finally, in 1938, he really actually kind of withdrew from conference, and Cedar Grove went off on its own, though there were efforts for the next 2 years to try to work some kind of solution out, which were inevitably unsuccessful. And then in the midst of all that, in 1935, John S. Burkholder had died, and Franklin County had no bishops, and so the Lancaster bishops stepped in and had oversight over the Franklin County churches. They tried to move ahead in 1936 with a bishop ordination here in Franklin County, but the leadership in Washington County objected to some of the persons who were in the lot for bishop, because some of them had, just quite frankly, been supporters of John F. Grove and were also premillennial. All right, those were kind of the objections to them. And so that bishop ordination fell through. But in 1938, Chris Martin and Moses K. Hurst were ordained bishops. Now, Denton Martin was the older bishop in Washington County, but he was a sick man. He had diabetes. He wasn't well. He wasn't really able to function all the time. He was often sick and in bed. And so Washington County, the district, ordained a new bishop. But one of the things that's interesting is that they ordained Chris Martin first. They were ordained about a week or so apart. They ordained Chris Martin first, and then Moses K. Hurst. And I don't know how you all do. I don't know how you all do with like moderators conference, but back then, who's the moderator? Well, the moderator of conference was dependent on who was the oldest ordained, who was the bishop ordained, or the earliest ordained bishop. He was the moderator of conference. Okay. And the Lancaster Conference bishops who were in charge of the whole thing, and I mean, there were about 3 bishops who sat in on the bishop meetings here in Washington Franklin during those years. They made sure that the new Franklin County bishop, after Denton Martin died, was going to be the moderator of conference. That was a very purposeful thing, because they were concerned that if a Washington County bishop was in charge, especially a very strong leader like Moses K. Hurst, it would cause more difficulty. All right. In 1939, 1940, the Cedar Grove split was finalized, but there was a small group at Cedar Grove led by Deacon Jonas Eschman who did not want to leave conference. And so they began to meet at Rife's. I think in the afternoon, and sometimes Rice didn't have church every Sunday at that particular point. And they met there for 20 years almost. Okay, there, as a separate congregation. Moses Hurst didn't really like that. He thought that they should simply become part of the Rife's congregation. Of course, that would have made things easier for him as far as administration go. But a promise had been made to Jonas Martin, that they would respect the fact that this was a distinct congregation. All right. In 1943, Denton Martin died. Chris Martin became the moderator of conference. And Chris Martin was a very capable leader. And he was, I would say, a person able to carry his own weight, particularly when working with Moses K. Hurst, who was also a very capable, strong leader. All right. And in 1946, Chris Martin ordained Harvey Shank bishop, and the Franklin County district was divided into the Marion district, into the Chambersburg district, and Harvey had oversight of the Marion district. And it's obvious at this particular point in the conference, and it's not only happening in the conference, but it's happening elsewhere in the Mennonite church across the board. There's after World War II, and I think that it's some of this is stuff that's been brewing for a while, okay? But also, the World War II had a very significant impact on the church, because we have all these young men who have to leave to go and do CPS, have to go do alternative service and so on. They're away from their homes and so on like that. And they get into different communities. They meet persons from other areas and so on. And it creates somewhat of a firm. I think some of the ferment's good. Some of it, however, is bad. And it coincides with essentially what is a liberalization in the Mennonite church across the board. Now, that's not the only thing contributing to that, but that is an important factor. And of course, the thing you have to keep in mind is that you're talking here in the Valley about what is essentially the most conservative conference in the Mennonite church. All right. And so they're going to have, and then Washington County District being more conservative than the rest of the conference as a whole. All right. It's, for example, Moses K. Hurst, when it came to protesting against the radios, well, he says, that's obvious, we're not to have radios. And that's what he did in his district. You weren't allowed to have a radio, okay? And he also insisted upon stricter dress standards and so on like that. In the 20th century, there was kind of this move, for example, with your plain coats, there was this move away from wearing a frock coat. You all know what a frock coat is, don't you? Some younger people don't know what a frock coat is. But it has to do with how it's cut in the back and so on. But it's simply an older style of coat. Okay, well, in the 20th century, there was kind of a move away from that frock style to a sack coat, which just simply has a split down the middle and so on. In Franklin County, that became common and so on. There were still older men who wore the frock coat, and it was required of the ministry that they wear the frock coat. In Washington County, not everybody wore a frock coat down there, but it was really pretty much it was the main thing, that it was the style that was predominant down there. And so their dress standards, Moses was able to insisted on maintaining a much more conservative dress style than up here. And the interesting thing is, he's in Maryland down there, where they're the most conservative in nonconformity. Okay, then you have the Chambersburg district, which is still pretty conservative. Amos is Chris, and then Amos, our bishop there. Chris died in 1950, and Amos was ordained bishop in 1951 over the Chambersburg district. But in the middle of it, you have the Marion district, which is the most liberal. Okay, it's the most liberal, the most progressive thing. And so Moses, on his front door, has this district that is the most progressive one. And also it's the one where if people aren't happy with him, they feel the urge to kind of move up there and go there. All right? And that doesn't make him happy. He doesn't like that. All right? He had a very, very keen sense of in a sense, territory. Washington County was in a sense his territory. That was his bishop district, and he was very insistent. Of course, the discipline supported him in this. He was very insistent that the conference and the Lancaster bishops respect the geographic boundaries of Washington County as his bishop district and not meddle. The discipline said that no bishop or minister could interfere in the work of a district without the consent of the bishop of that district. And Moses never gave his consent. Never. Okay? He never did. And when the Franklin County bishops and the Lancaster County bishops got frustrated with him and began to kind of move into that, he would simply said, "You're violating the discipline." And they were. He had them on that, okay? He had them on that. Now, one could say maybe Moses should have been a little bit more cooperative, but he felt that if he didn't maintain this, his district, his church would go to the world. And he had good reason, seeing what is happening in the Marion district, to be worried about that, okay? So after the World War II, you have an increasing drift in nonconformity issues in the Marion district. You have this Eshelman's group that's kind of there. You have the Lancaster bishops being involved. Chris Martin dies in 1950. Amos is ordained in 1951. And Amos actually, his thinking is not that different from Moses's. as to what he would like to have happen, what he would like to see. He's sort of an old-fashioned kind of person, and that really kind of resonates with what Moses doing that there. So he has a lot of respect for what Moses trying to get accomplished. He doesn't always like how Moses does it. Okay, but he is very, very reluctant to do anything. He will not interfere in Moses' district. He does not want to do that until the 1960s. All right. And then the other thing that happens is in the 50s, Lancaster Conference starts mission churches in the Baltimore area, in Baltimore City and the area around Baltimore. And you have persons in Washington County who are interested in missions, but also are somewhat bristling over Moses, what they would say as his authoritarian leadership style. That's not my judgment. I'm saying what they're saying, okay? How they would look at it, and so on. But they're bristling at that. And so what a combination of both their interest in missions, which Moses isn't giving much space to or much effort to do much there in Washington County. So they began to travel to these mission stations, these Lancaster Conference mission stations, and began helping. And of course, these are new stations. They need workers and so on. And in comparison to Lancaster Conference, these persons from Washington County, they look pretty conservative to them. And they think, well, we're getting some good people here to help us out with this whole thing. Moses considers them to be, kind of troublemakers. I guess it is a matter of perspective. So it is. And that becomes an issue. All right. But the thing that really causes a problem is that Lancaster decides to sponsor a congregation in the southern part of Washington County, down in the tip of Washington County. There aren't any Mennonite churches down there, by the way, but it was down the tip. And Moses said, no, you can't do that. This is my territory. You're coming into an area you're not supposed to be. And again, it's being used. There are people in his congregations who want to help with that. And again, I think their reasons is a mixture of they'd rather be under Lancaster's discipline than Moses' discipline. All right. In 1959, after Chris dies in 1950, Moses becomes a moderator of conference, and he is a master at procedures, controlling the procedures. And he has felt these Lancaster bishops have just been nothing but a burr in his saddle. And so he puts forth a resolution. And the resolution is worded like this. It's not the last exact wording, but this is essentially the sense of it. Okay, the resolution was to vote to retain the Lancaster bishops as members of conference. There were 3 bishops who were considered to be bishops in Washington Franklin Conference. Do you understand the difference here? The proposal he has is to vote to retain them. All right? And it needed a 2/3 vote, and he didn't have it. They didn't have it. They didn't have a 2/3 vote. Essentially what it was, though, was a vote to dismiss them. If he would have rephrased it as, we want to release the Lancaster bishops, that would not have carried either. Okay? And so the way he phrased it meant that the Lancaster bishops were out because they didn't vote to retain them. All right? So he got them out. They were no longer here. So it was just, at that particular point, it was just Harvey and Amos and Mose. And Stanley Martin had been ordained a bishop, but he was not well. He actually had a stroke. And then shortly after that, Harvey ordained a new bishop, Malin Eshelman, and Mose ordained Reuben Martin as bishop. So they both had junior bishops. Harvey, by this time, was an older man. He was still somewhat active and so on, but he wasn't. His most productive years had passed. So then we come to the years 1963 to 1965. These are the crucial years in which the conference actually is moving toward a division. All right. And again, one of the main issues is Lancaster Conference moving into the southern part of Washington County and starting a mission church there, using Washington County members as workers. And most is not like that. The other thing that happens in October of 63, Moses' deacon, Abel Martin, at Rice, and a preacher, one of the preachers at Clear Spring, Amos E. Hurst, are objecting to some of the ways in which Moses uses the discipline. All right. And they appeal to the Franklin County bishops for help, for relief. Okay. Now, I would just have to say that Abel Martin was not by any means a progressive. He was a really conservative-minded leader. I'm not sure about Amos Hurst, but Abel certainly was not. But it was, I don't think that somebody like Abel had any problem with the standards in Washington County. He did have some problems with the way Mose administrated. Okay. And Mose was a very strict disciplinarian. Okay. He really was. But I should also just simply say that he was able to pull it off because that's what most of his people wanted. He was not shoehorning most of his people into doing this. They wanted what he was trying to do. Okay. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right. There are always a minority of dissenters, and Abel was a dissenter, and Amos was a dissenter, and there were persons at Rice Church and at Clear Spring who also objected to Moses' style. Okay. And in June, and this is the point at which Amos Martin finally felt he could no longer go along with just simply letting Moses do what he was doing. Some of it had to do with the fact that he had some very close friends down there who were part of this Rice and Clear Spring group. And he felt, I think actually one of his friends appealed to him and I think I interviewed Amos back in 1980. When I was in college, I interviewed him for a project I was doing on the history of Shady Pine. I really had a wonderful interview with him. He was really a forthright. I mean, I shouldn't say forthright. That's not what I meant, but he told me all kinds of things. I was surprised at the things that he told me about the beginnings of Shady Pine and so on. He was very open and informative about all that. But at that particular point, Amos just felt that he could not support Moses anymore. And the Lancaster bishops, and of course, one of the things you have to remember is that whenever there's trouble here in Franklin County or in Washington County, they always go to Lancaster. Okay, so they appealed again to these two Lancaster bishops who also supported the Abel Martin, Amos Hurst group. And so in June of 1964, this group of members from Clear Spring and from Rice were basically organized as a congregation under the oversight of the Franklin County bishops. And that Mose did not like. Okay, he said, that's a violation of the discipline. You have moved into my bishop district without my consent. All right. And that's a violation of the discipline. And he was right. It was a violation of the discipline. All right. And okay. In August of 1964, Amos Martin visited Moses K. Hurst And Amos told him, I do not want to have a congregation in Washington County. And Moses said, in that case, go home and mind your own affairs. And Amos went home, but he didn't mind his own affairs. All right. In 1964, at the conference meeting, was very tense, but Moses, the moderator, pretty well controlled the agenda. He pretty much controlled the meeting, and not much was accomplished or discussed. And then after conference meeting, Moses and Reuben Martin moved against the Rife Clear Spring group. They suspended Abel and Amos from their ministry, and as a result, 1/5 of the congregation at Rice refused to go along with communion, and only 19 of the 49 members at Clear Spring took communion that fall. Abel Martin and some lay members appealed to Amos Hurst and to Abel Martin to pull out and organize a congregation, and that's what happened, again with the assistance of the Franklin County bishops. There were two issues. One, of course, was the treatment of these members at Rice Clear Spring and of Abel and of Amos. But the other thing that particularly some of the members who left with Amos Hurst and Abel Martin, one of the things that they brought up is that at council meeting, the tradition was in council meeting that you went back into the room and you expressed your peace testimony and your willingness to abide by the discipline of the church. But it was also, and I'm sure this is still true for you, it's also a time in which the members have an opportunity to share concerns with the ministry. If they have a concern, that's typically traditionally the time to do it. Moses got rid of that second part. He said, the council meeting, the purpose is to get people ready for communion. Okay? And so his members were basically instructed that when they came back to the council room, what he wanted to hear from them was a statement that they're at peace with God and man, and that they are in agreement with the standards of the church. No complaints. All right? No complaints, no concerns. That's all they wanted. And this was interesting because this was particularly bothersome to some of the older members who did not like that change. All right? And so that was brought up. In March of 1965, Franklin County bishops and took Rice and Clear Spring under their official oversight, and there were 187 members in this new congregation at Rice Clear Spring, which later on became known as Mount Olive when they bought a property, built a church house, and so on. They were meeting on the alternate weeks at Rice and at Clear Springs at this particular point. And that was about 20% of the district membership, those 187 people. And Moses said that the Franklin County bishops were in violation of the discipline. And on August 9th, 1965, the Franklin County bishops met with the Washington County ministry to discuss this, and Moses basically told them, you are in violation of the discipline, and no person who's in violation of the discipline can be a member of conference, and so you are no longer a member of conference. Okay, that's what the declaration he made. All right, and Amos Martin said, when 15 men tell 32 that they are out of conference, I have no respect for that type of administration. Okay, that's what Amos said to him. That August 13th, the Franklin County ministry reorganized themselves as a conference. They held their fall conference on September 6th with the Rife Clear Spring congregation joining them. And the Mennonite yearbook, after this split happened in 1966, when they came out with the new yearbook, we had two groups here, both of who were calling themselves Washington Franklin Conference. And so the editor of the yearbook simply said, okay, one's up in Franklin County, one's down in Washington County. We're going to call the one north and we're going to call the one south. Both groups in their official documents, simply refer to themselves as Washington Franklin Conference, Mennonite Conference, all right? Well, after this, and again, looking at kind of the numbers, Washington Franklin North has around 1,194 members, and Washington Franklin South has 627 members. And so it's not quite a 1/3, 2/3 division. And after the division, Washington Franklin North embarks on a flurry of activities. They start a whole bunch of things. In a sense, I think that there were persons who were just waiting to be able to do some things, and they could never get conference to approve it because Mose didn't want to do that. He thought that was, he didn't support some of those things. And so you have Cove Valley Camp being started, you have Menno Haven being started, you have all these various institutions being started. Okay? And I'll let you decide whether those were good things or not. But at the same time, it's fairly obvious, okay, it's fairly obvious, particularly in the Marion district, that the increase in worldliness is becoming pronounced. Young people are departing from plain dress. Coverings are getting smaller. Young girls are not wearing cape dresses anymore. The TV is coming in somewhat secretively and so on. I remember a story at Shady Pine that was told somewhat jokingly when I was there in the late 70s, early 80s, that, you know, the one family had a TV and they had it on a portable stand so that when the ministers or anybody came by, they put it in the closet because they weren't supposed to have a TV. They did it anyhow. And then maybe a little bit more scary, though I would say I don't think TV is a good idea. But is the whole question of divorce and remarriage actually begins to be touted around. And that is something that's happening in the larger Mennonite church. That becomes a contested issue in the 1950s and 1960s. And by the 1960s, most of the conferences in the Mennonite church have allowed divorce and remarriage. Lancaster's holding out on that for a while and so on. Now, there are no members, okay, there are no members in the conference at this particular point who are divorced and remarried, but it becomes a question, becomes an issue because in their outreaches and so on, they're encountering people who are in this situation. And some folks say, is there a way for us to accommodate this? And so this is a discussion in July of 1966. It reveals the fact that in the conference, in Washington Franklin North, there is some disagreement. Okay, and actually there's a fair amount of disagreement among certain elements in the leaders in the conference over these issues. And in its regular conference in September of 66, the conference decided it's time to revise the discipline. And again, this brings up discussions, particularly about TV and about divorce and remarriage. But it also, one of the other things that happens is the way in which conference was structured, and particularly the fact that so much authority was given to the moderator to really control the procedures of conference. And that in the minds of the Franklin County leaders, that had created such a logjam. They couldn't ever get around Mose because he knew exactly how to use those procedures. And so they revised some of those procedures so that not one person could any longer do that. Now, they still had a moderator, but one of the things the discipline changed was it created this executive committee that really did control and made a decision about what the agenda was and everything like that. And so that was a major change in the organization of conference. Well, in the meantime, in 1967, Abel Martin withdrew from conference. He was concerned, and like I said, you have to remember that these people living in Washington County, their next door neighbors is Marion and those sets of churches, which are the most progressive, most liberal. There are changes are happening and so on. He pulls out of Washington Franklin North and starts to attend at Stowstown. And Stowstown was started in 1962. And I think there are a few people who could tell us a little bit more about that here, but in 1960, out in York County, I think it's York County, or is it Adams County, at Hampton, a congregation was formed made up of basically Lancaster Conference people. Roy Geigley was the leader. And then a couple years later, there's this set of people up in Cumberland County from the Dillers congregation, an interesting group of people because they are persons who some years earlier had moved from Franconia Conference because they felt Franconia was getting too liberal, and they moved out here to Cumberland County where things were more conservative, but only to have to be faced with the fact that down the road, changes were happening there. And so you have some of these folks also pulling out of Lancaster Conference and becoming part of this Hampton congregation. And then in 1962, I think it is, they move over and form the Stylestown congregation. And that then becomes part of the nation, what becomes known as the Nationwide Fellowship. And of course, there were some persons from this congregation that went with that, the Bears in particular, and some of the Whitmers. And Abel Martin goes up there, Morris Martin and Dan Martin. There are about, I don't know, maybe a dozen persons from Rife Clear Spring who left there and went up to Stylestown. And they soon then, Roy Geigley organized the Hagerstown Mennonite Fellowship. All right. In 1968, at the August session, a new discipline was adopted. And on the whole, it was a fairly conservative document. It maintained all the old rules on dress. TV was not allowed. Divorce and remarriage was not allowed. The one thing that was changed was the use of the radio should be rigidly controlled by Christian ethical standards. All right, before it had been protested against. And now it should be rigidly controlled by Christian ethical standards. I wonder how they thought that was going to happen. But anyhow, I think it just simply indicated the fact that the radio had in many quarters become quite predominant. And there wasn't, again, once something gets established, it's really hard to reverse that. But in the meantime, okay, Amos is not happy. He is not happy with the drift that he's seeing. He's particularly not happy with working with the bishops in the Marion district because he does not feel as though they are enforcing the discipline, and they aren't enforcing the discipline. And that's very clear. I mean, you have this discipline that's basically a very conservative discipline, but it's not being enforced. When I was taken in Shady Pine in 1977, now this is like, 9 years, about 10 years later in that, we were still using that discipline. And in that discipline, it said that brethren were to wear black hats and plain coats, and the sisters were to wear square corner coverings with strings and bonnets and cape dresses. Now, there were some plain coats still in that congregation, a few cape dresses. But the rest of the stuff, and I remember Bishop Omer Martin going through the discipline with me at the last instruction meeting and explaining to me the parts that really didn't apply anymore. And this is only 9 years later after they approved this discipline. Now, in 1980, they did revise it to actually kind of fit in with their actual practice and so on. So they had this discipline on paper, but the Marion district really wasn't enforcing it, and Amos felt that it should be enforced. However, not all his congregations wanted him to enforce the discipline as it was given. In 1967, the Pleasant View congregation voted to release Amos from overseeing their congregation. In the spring of 1969, Shady Pine voted likewise, and so now Amos has only Chambersburg, Rock Hill, the Row, and Strasburg. And my sense is that at that particular point, some of you who may know better, that Burns Valley was just considered to be part of the Row congregation at that particular point. That's sort of my sense, okay, because it's not distinguished as a separate congregation at this point. All right? And then, in January of 1969, a small group of persons, primarily from the Chambersburg congregation, reached out to the newly formed Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Church. And I talked to Daniel Lehman about this a number of years ago, and he said that, and of course, his father was one of those persons. Daniel was also one of those persons. He said, we just didn't know if Amos was going to do anything. There was this drift happening, but we didn't know if he was going to do anything about it. And so they kind of lost confidence, and they reached out to Eastern Pennsylvania bishops, and Isaac Samsnake and Homer Bomberger came in and helped organize the Culberson congregation. And then finally, on August 12, 1969, at a meeting of the Rice Clear Spring Church congregation, Amos told them that he could not go along with conference under the present setup. And he met a committee from the Row, leaders from the Row, Strasburg, and Rice Clear Spring got together with Amos and drew up a statement. And Amos presented that statement to conference on August 28th, 1969. And this is what the statement says. Due to the differences of administration within our conference, I, as bishop, with the support of those of the ministry I have contacted, Rice Clear Spring, the Rice Clear Spring Group, Congregation, Row, and Strasburg, request conference for the privilege of working according to biblical interpretation of the discipline. We're asking our sisters to wear the plain cape dress. Also would ask our brothers to wear the plain garb prescribed by our discipline, as we cannot accept cut hair for our sisters and are asking that hair be put up and a two-piece covering of a consistent size be worn. TV cannot be accepted for our members. And so Amos is basically saying, I want to abide by the discipline that we've just approved a year ago. And it's obvious that it's not being followed in some quarters. And he sees no indication. He's making this plea that essentially the other bishops follow the discipline. And Malin Eshman, who's the senior bishop in the Marion district, he, in response to this statement, he acknowledges the fact that no, he should have been more careful in implementing the discipline. I knew Malin as a teenager, and then later on, he was a very kindly sort of person, and so on. But he was not by any means a disciplinarian. He just didn't have that within him. I think that my feelings is that he was saddened by the drift that finally occurred in his district and in the conference he remained part of, but he did not have the fortitude to stand against it. All right, and so over the next year, all right, in the spring of 1970, Amos read his statement at the council meetings in his district, and as a consequence, Chambersburg and Rock Hill voted to release Amos from their oversight of their congregations. And Malin came in and took oversight of those congregations and served them communion and so on. On August 11th, Amos met with his ministry, and they planned to ask for a withdrawal from conference. And he sent a statement to the secretary, to Merle Cordell, the secretary at conference, with this request. And also another request was sent by the ministry at Rice Clear Spring. And this is what Amos asked in August of 1970. In view of the diversity of doctrine and practice and administrative policies that exist in our conference, and in the best interest of our church life as well as future brotherhood relations, we, the ministry of the Row and Strasburg congregations, are requesting a release from organizational ties with our conference, would ask for our understanding consideration of our request, hoping that in the future we still have a consideration and friendship one with another. Amos did not want to have, what I read in this statement, I think it's probably true, Amos did not want to have a nasty church split. Okay, he wanted this to be as amiable and agreeable and as possible. Okay, he wasn't talking about putting people out of conference, which is what Mose basically did. He's asking, it's really, I can't really work with this anymore. We're asking for a release. And so that the Ripe Clear Spring congregation said, through the ordained brethren and council brethren of the Ripe Clear Spring congregation and Eurosburg congregations are in support of Bishop Amos Martin's statement to conference and request his continued oversight as bishop. Okay, the conference that met there in August, I think that they were saddened by this. I think some people, some of the leadership, because they didn't have some of the convictions that Amos and the more conservative element in the conference would have had, felt, you're really making issues about things that we, can't we just love each other and get along and so on and accept the diversity and so on. But nonetheless, there is kind of a note of sadness there. But they asked him, can you put this off until we invite some outside bishops to come in and meet with us and discuss this? Basically, I think what they wanted to do is they wanted to stave off this separation. And Amos agreed to that. And so on November 2nd, 1970, there was a special session of conference, and two Lancaster Conference bishops, the moderator of Lancaster Conference, David Thomas, and Donald Lawther, who was bishop of the Juniata district in Lancaster Conference, and then the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Bishop Aaron Shank. These three bishops were called in to sit in the conference and to give advice and to give the workout and arrangement. And the upshot of it was Amos said, no, we have to leave. And his ministry supported that. And so conference released them from that. And that effected. And then on November 18th, Amos and his ministry from Strasbourg, Rice, Clear Spring, and the Row met, and they organized the Cumberland Valley Mennonite Church. And interestingly enough, they went back to the 1957 discipline and adopted that as their discipline rather than the 1868. And if you look at the breakdown, there were 800, the next year in the Mennonite yearbook, there were 810 members in what was still called Washington Franklin North, and 338 members in the Cumberland Valley Mennonite Church. So it's a 2/3, 1/3 split. But if you keep in mind the fact that 5 years earlier, okay, you have a third of the conference. You have 627 members, and Washington County is growing during these years too. I mean, they're prospering, they're growing. I didn't have a chance to look it up. Their membership has increased, and so, and the interesting thing is that the Washington Franklin North Conference, despite all of its efforts at outreach and so on, really isn't growing. It's not that much bigger before the split than it was in 1965. Okay, but what this means is that in 1970, with Amos's departure, the majority of Mennonites in this valley are conservative and plain. Now, they're in different groups. You have Nationwide Fellowship, you have Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Church, you have the Cumberland Valley Mennonite Church, and you have the Washington Franklin Mennonite Church. But most of the Mennonites in this valley are plain. There is no other place that's like that. Okay, there's no other place like that. Lancaster had a sizable minority of people who were plain and so on, but the numbers here in our valley are very different. Sorry, Clint, I went over 5 minutes. Okay? All right, that's what I have to share. Do you want questions? If you have any questions, I'll try to be not to go on and on about them, anything. Yes, Alan. Okay. I don't know. I haven't looked at it the last couple of years. I know that Franklin Mennonite Conference couple years ago, their membership was around 1,000. They really haven't grown that significantly over the years. Washington County probably has 1,800 to 2,000 members. I'm not sure how many members are in your church group. Eastern probably has 200 to 225 members here in the Valley. Pilgrim probably has probably about that number too. This is all just guesswork, okay? I'm just kind of thinking about how big those congregations are. And Nationwide Fellowship is actually smaller than it used to be. Okay, Stoustown is quite a bit smaller than it was years ago. Spring Valley is, and of course, Hagerstown Christian Fellowship was laid down. And some of those people went Eastern, and there's an Eastern congregation there. And that's very interesting because there had been sort of this agreement between the Eastern Church and the Washington Franklin Church, even though many of the people who made up the Eastern Church in Franklin County were from Washington County, that they would not have a church in Washington County. But when the Fellowship Church was disbanded, there was this empty church house, and some of the people from there had gone Eastern. And so Eastern approached Washington County and said, is it okay if we use this church house and start a congregation there? And the Washington County leadership agreed to that. So, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? I hope this hasn't been too boring. So, all right. Okay, Clinton, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hymns of the Church, number 1002. Number 1002 in Hymns of the Church. And I just point out at the bottom of the page, the ladies have a trio, so you could be ready for that. Oh.
Well, thank you, Brother Edsel, for coming and sharing that. Would there be any other further questions or comments before we dismiss? I know we have some other various historians here, people who lived through it. Okay. Brother Edsel's final comment is he's glad Brother Amos did what he did. Thanks. Anybody else? Well, if not, Dad, would you want to come and have the benediction? If you have any comments or anything you want to fill in, feel free as well.
I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I'm glad Amos wasn't Moses Hurst. As I read history, I don't know. I should have written things down as he was speaking, because I guess I'll say this, that I worked with Amos. He worked for my dad in the chicken house, and I had a lot of conversations with Amos. And I also worked with Ellis. And Ellis told me one time that if his uncle, Chris, would have been in that modernistic, progressive movement, he probably would have been with him. I'm already going by. Yeah, well, I'm not going to belabor that point, but I thought about that over the years. Yeah. Yeah, well, Chris. Not Amos, not Chris. Unless my ears were hearing wrong, but I don't think they were. Mm. Yeah.
And it's, he was actually maintaining a fairly conservative
Mhm.
until it was divided.
Right, yeah. I know Amos gets a lot of criticism for this, that, and the other thing, but after having working with him in the dirty old chicken house for numerous years, I gained a lot of respect for him. I could ask him questions, anything, more than I even thought of even asking my dad. And so, I found it interesting working with Amos that I'd ask him a question and he would answer the question, and he almost would go into a preaching mode. I mean, I don't know if you remember how he preached or not, but he was very excited and all that. And up there in the old chicken house, I mean, he would go into it. A lot of memories from that. You mentioned about the tobacco issue. I don't know the people's name connected to this, but someone righted some of the Franklin County people for using tobacco. And the Franklin County people said, well, that's probably true, but you ones, speaking to the ones in Lancaster County, said, you ones grow it and we use it. So who's the worst of the two? I don't know. Yeah. Okay, well, there's probably could be a lot of other memories. I know there is, but that's interesting conversation. Okay, let's stand and be dismissed. Father in heaven, we thank you for our history. We thank you that we have a God that we can serve. And we know that as relation to conservative, as we believe the Bible would teach us to live, we know that, Lord, it all comes down to we still have to be obedient to the scriptures. We have to reckon that Christ is the head of the church and that we need to be insubordinate to that. So we thank you for the provisions that we have made for our salvation, the redemption of salvation that we have through the church that only comes through Christ. So pray you bless Edsel for sharing tonight and help us to go forward praising you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
The trumpet